Welcome to the Mongabay Newscast. I'm your host, Mike DiGirolamo, bringing you the news and inspiration from nature's front line. This week on the newscast, we present to you episode 3 in our Congo Basin season of our long-form podcast series, Mongabay Explores. The first 2 episodes, which you can find in the show notes. This episode features 4 different experts who discuss the complex pressures that great apes face, specifically bonobos and mountain gorillas, the lessons learned from decades of conservation efforts, and ways forward for sustainable conservation models. Each episode in Mongabay Explores can be listened to individually, including this one, but they do complement one another, so if you aren't already subscribed to Mongabay Explores, I encourage you to do so on the podcast provider of your choice so you can listen to previous episodes. This is the last episode in the season that we'll be sharing here on the newscast, so if you want to hear the remaining episodes, make sure to subscribe to Mongabay Explores. We'll return next week here on the newscast with our regularly planned one-on-one interviews, but in the meantime, enjoy episode 3 of Mongabay Explores, the Congo Basin. A study published in 2021 suggests that under a best-case scenario where humans make an effort to slow greenhouse gas emissions and tackle climate change, Africa's great apes will still lose 85% of their range by 2050. And in a scenario where we do nothing, that increases to 94% of their range. Impacts from human population growth, hunting, clearing of land, and the bushmeat trade all contribute to the loss of various great ape species in the Congo Basin. Historically, they've lived in a much larger area, but today, that area is more confined. The clock is ticking for them, and solutions await for their survival. I'm Mike DiGirolamo. This is Mongabay Explores, a podcast series about our world's unique places, species, and the people working to save them. You're listening to episode 3 of our 4th season, Mongabay Explores, the Congo Basin. In this episode, we look at 2 great ape species, mountain gorillas and bonobos, the conservation challenges they face, why their protection is so crucial, not just for forest health and biodiversity, but also for the livelihoods of people that live in the Congo Basin. Most great ape species live outside of protected areas, which also happen to be on suitable land for agricultural commodities, making their conservation prospects even more of a challenge. However, mountain gorillas live almost exclusively in protected areas, which a growing number of humans are living near, increasing pressure on them. While they are the only great ape species that has increased its population recently, the challenges they face now have implications for the conservation of other great ape species. Bonobos, on the other hand, live only within the Democratic Republic of Congo and also face a host of human-related pressures around the areas they live in, which are exacerbated by conflict, making certain conservation models, like ecotourism, very difficult to implement. Some of our guests say there is great conservation potential in the DRC if security in the country can be realized. I spoke with a number of researchers and conservationists for this episode. Dr. Terese Hart, a researcher with the ICCN, the Congolese Institute for the Conservation of Nature, Dr. Gladys Kalema-Zikusoka, a wildlife veterinarian and founder of the NGO Conservation Through Public Health, Dr. Kirsty Graham, a researcher from the University of St. Andrews, and Sally Coxe, co-founder and president of the Bonobo Conservation Initiative. I wanted to get more information about these 2 great ape species, the trends from decades of conservation work, and the challenges that remain. The message is clear that protecting great apes is a must for protecting biodiversity, as great ape species serve as an umbrella for conservation, but that doing so is no easy task, particularly in the DRC. Dr. Terese Hart has been working in the land that is the DRC since the 1970s. First starting as a Peace Corps volunteer. She says at the time when she first started in the region, there was no violence. I asked her to describe what has changed.
I'm Terese Hart. I'm now a researcher with the Institut Congolais pour la Conservation de la Nature, ICCN, working with Abraham Foundation. When I was a Peace Corps volunteer, my husband was on a fellowship living with pygmies, actually, doing a study of their hunting. And at that time, we could just bicycle from Bunia, which was what was then Oriental province, in the northern part of the Albertine Rift. We could bicycle all the way down the Albertine Rift, all the way down to Goma through the park, and bicycle back again. No problems. We slept outside. We slept with missionaries. There was no violence at the time. From an environmentalist view, when we first bicycled the Rift, we were bicycling through mountain forests. All that does not exist anymore. But what we saw was a strange combination of a colonialist past, which had not quite been let go, and it certainly had not turned into a burgeoning new nation. I remember as Peace Corps, we had 6 weeks of training, and we had Congolese college professors doing some of our teaching. And one of them, this was in 1974, so it was a very young nation then, and they were so optimistic, so extremely optimistic of where Mobutu was going to take the nation and what was ahead. But in reality, there were some real problems.
What Dr. Hart finds interesting about bonobos is where they lived, and also how closely they lived with humans. This eventually led to the formation of what is known as Lomami National Park, one of the many national parks in the DRC, and is also a bonobo habitat.
I'm not a behavioralist, but what interested us was that there was a huge area with no population living in it on the map that we could see, and on satellite images, it was dense forest uncut by roads, and it was unknown whether or not bonobos actually were within that whole area, or if they were where they had been seen was further north. And so we set out to find this out, and we were amazed at how close they lived with people. I mean, how close to human settlements they lived, and how far south and east they were, much farther than had been thought.
Bonobos are endemic to the DRC, living nowhere else in the world. One possible explanation as to why includes a separation from chimpanzees that occurred over 1 million years ago, where chimpanzees crossed the Congo River to the north, leaving bonobos confined south of the river. These two great ape species are the closest extant relatives to humans. In fact, bonobos share 99% of their DNA with human beings. Despite the common origin between the two great apes, chimpanzees have gotten the lion's share of research thus far over bonobos. Dr. Kirsty Graham, who has been studying bonobo communication in the DRC, explains why bonobo study is crucial to understanding our last common ancestors.
My name is Kirsty Graham, and I'm a research fellow at the University of St. Andrews. I study how bonobos use gestures to communicate. I worked with wild bonobos at Wamba, which is a field site run by Kyoto University, but it's in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is the only place in the world you can find bonobos. And I'm really interested in how they communicate with one another using this gestural system of bodily communication. So I have spent 18 months total working with the bonobos there, and I cataloged over 70 gesture types. They use them to communicate a whole load of social goals. And they seem to use gestures quite flexibly, but they mean specific things in specific contexts. So it's a really interesting communication system. Bonobos and chimpanzees separated as species around 1 million years ago. We think that a small founder population of chimpanzees crossed the Congo River during a shallow like a drier period. And then they became different species, but they're both equally related to humans. And so it's really important that we study both of them if we want to understand what our last common ancestor was like. But chimpanzees have been studied far more than bonobos. And so we're basing a lot of what we think our last common ancestor was on chimpanzees, and even particularly on like these few groups of East African chimpanzees, where bonobos offer this like different view into how our last common ancestor might have behaved. Bonobos are really interesting socially. So compared to East African chimpanzee groups, the females tend to be a lot more central. They tend to lead like where the group travels. They get feeding priority. The females engage in sexual behavior with one another, so they like embrace and rub their genitals together. They form these really like tight networks, which we don't see much in like East African chimpanzee females. And so they're these quite like cohesive groups in which the females form the core. They have peaceful intergroup relationships in general. So it can be really stressful when they meet neighboring groups, and sometimes they'll avoid each other, but often they will come together and vocalize and groom each other and rub genitals with one another. And it's sort of these really big encounters where in chimpanzees, like there is very little tolerance between groups. There's lethal interactions and like aggression between groups. So that's a really important difference there. So yeah, it's so crucial that we study chimpanzees and like all of the chimpanzee subspecies and different communities, and also that we study these different communities of bonobos.
Between bonobos and chimpanzees, bonobos are often described as the more peaceful or less aggressive of the two. They are notable for, among many things, resolving conflict through sexual interaction. Reportedly, other than humans, they are one of the only species that does it for fun. And they exhibit altruistic behavior, such as adopting infants from outside their own family.
Yeah, that was research that was done by a friend of mine, Nahoko Tokiyama, and they saw cases of adoption where these infants were adopted from a neighboring group. So again, we're going back to this like these intergroup relationships where you're not just killing the neighboring groups, but they're actually like there have been these couple of documented cases where they've adopted infants from other groups. There have been cases of adoption in chimpanzees too within their group, but from different, like if the mother's disappeared or has died, then sometimes they'll adopt other chimpanzee infants. So it's not unheard of in chimpanzees to adopt infants too, but the unusual part of this is that it's happening between these neighboring groups.
And they have the capacity to mourn the loss of members of their groups for lengthy periods. Dr. Hart witnessed a mourning event where bonobos stayed with a deceased group member for almost a week.
Things that have touched us have been bonobos mourning. We came across a group of bonobos in trees, and there was a dead bonobo on the ground, and they stayed there for several days. And the dead bonobo, as far as we could tell, had died of some natural reasons. It was thin, but the other bonobos, they talked, but they stayed there. They didn't move on as though nothing had happened. They stayed there nearly a week after the bonobo had died. They would, move around the area, but be back there in the evening. And so I thought that was, an emotion, a reluctance to let one of their own go. And it makes the bonobo trade, the great ape trade, all the more devastating.
It's difficult to pinpoint or estimate how many bonobos are currently in the wild, and a recent study shows that climate change may be affecting scientists' abilities to estimate populations due to the impact of lengthening the amount of time it takes for nests to decay, possibly leading to an overcount. This is a tough situation, as counting nests is widely used as the gold standard for great ape population estimates.
Yeah, so one of the ways that we estimate population density for great apes is counting their nests. They build nests that they sleep in at night. Sometimes they build nests during the day too, which again complicates the picture for how we're estimating the density. But yeah, it's really important that we understand how quickly nests degrade. And so that's a really important step to understanding the population density for bonobos. And yeah, I think the estimates for bonobos may be higher, both because the changes in nest degradation, also because of changes in behavior if they're building more nests during the day. And so having like specific research on nesting behavior and also using other survey techniques for figuring out the remaining bonobo population, it's going to be key moving forward for conservation efforts.
It's a problem that affects the counting of many great ape species, not just bonobos. Climatic data from 2003 to 2018 suggests that the decay time for nests increased by 17 days. This led scientists to conclude that populations of bonobos could be far lower than current estimates. Barbara Fruth, senior author on the study, told Mongabay, "You can apply this to all great apes." So how many are there exactly? Unsurprisingly, it's difficult to say. Dr. Hart told me that estimating bonobo populations, even from a pretty sizable chunk of land, is risky. Where she works in the Lomami National Park, which is roughly 3,400 square miles, there's a giant variety of forests, and within them, varying degrees of population density. Getting a read on how many there are just in this park is no small task. While counting nests might be the primary method, it's not the only one, as Dr. Hart points out.
The main problem is not the, my thought is not the nest decay rate, but it is the expansion, the generalization of the population. So that often bonobos are studied where they're densest because that's where you can get the most information. But in the Lomami National Park, there are areas where there are no bonobos. There are areas where there are quite a few bonobos. And so my husband, when we've been doing censuses, inventories, monitoring inventories throughout the park, with quite good coverage of the whole 8,874 square kilometers since about 2014. And we're not doing dung decay rates. We're looking for signs of bonobos in terms of feeding signs, actual sightings, or audio, contact. And based on that, he can come up with relative density and throughout the park, and they are not evenly distributed, and it's not always clear what all of the environmental preferences are. But the forest is not at all evenly one type. There's river forest, there are plateau forests, there are seasonally flooded forests, there are forests encircling edaphic savannas. So the forest is extremely varied. And within that, that tapestry, the density of the bonobos goes up and down. So to try to generalize from one, 80 square kilometer patch of forest that you looked at, over thousands of square kilometers is kind of risky.
However, especially in a country like the DRC, counting how many bonobos there are is incredibly difficult, especially in the face of violent conflicts that continue in the country to this day. Current publicized population estimates are extremely variable, going down to as little as 10,000 to as high as 50,000. In my interviews with every source, no one would or could give me an estimate. The latest estimate from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology is at least 10,000 to 20,000, but notably, that only covers under 30% of bonobos' range. Regardless of how large their range is today, experts say the prospects for bonobos and all great ape species are dire, as that range is expected to be reduced by 85% by 2050 due to climate change. I asked Dr. Graham to describe to me the impact this could have on bonobo populations and other great ape species.
Great apes used to be distributed much more widely historically, and so that's why we get sort of gorillas and chimpanzees and bonobos in Africa and orangutans all the way over in Indonesia and Malaysia, that there used to be this continuum where great apes were spread sort of globally around these tropical areas. But as those climate zones have shifted, we've seen that area contract. And so that's why we now only find orangutans in this like very small area where the fruit seasonality isn't so extreme that they can't survive. I think that's a huge issue if we're thinking about shifting climate zones now because of human-caused climate change. Is this like, how does it affect fruiting seasonality, particularly in like these forest-dwelling bonobos and chimpanzees? That's going to be difficult for them. Where I am at the moment, I'm at Fongoli in Senegal, working with savanna chimpanzees. And now these are the groups that are going to be at the very sort of sharp end of climate change. They're living already in really extreme climates. It's been upwards of like 44, 45 degrees Celsius out here this week. They're looking for water, they're looking for food. And I think we're going to see this shrinking on particularly savanna populations. And I think there are also bonobos who live in the savanna or savanna mosaic habitats. I'm thinking about Laktumba and Malebo, and they're going to be sort of particularly vulnerable to changes in temperature and like water and food access.
But climate change isn't the only threat they face. Trafficking, habitat loss, and hunting greatly impact their numbers. One of these, however, stands out, according to Dr. Hart.
Hunting. Hunting is still a major threat, not to take the babies, but for the meat. And within the park itself, this is quite well controlled. Less well controlled in the buffer zone, and outside of the buffer zone, they're not good controls at all.
Habitat encroachment due to deforestation for agriculture is a problem for bonobos near, though not inside of Lomami or its buffer zones, according to Dr. Hart, which she says have a growing number of people living near them.
One of the great assets of Lomami National Park is that the buffer zone 2, a lot of it is uninhabited forest, hunted but uninhabited. And so there's no population in the park and low population in the buffer zone. But on the southeast side, Kindu is a very quickly growing center. And that's the capital of Maniema province. And we have seen agriculture and deforestation expand into areas that we know were bonobo habitat and had bonobo. Now, they're not in the park. They're not even in the official buffer zone, but we know that the forest is disappearing, and with it, of course, bonobos. We know that there was a population very close to Olengati, which is in the buffer zone. It's the edge of the buffer zone. We know that Olengati has increased, and the area that did have bonobos is now farmed.
But trafficking, while claiming less lives than the bushmeat trade, is still a huge issue for the species and can often occur in tandem with trafficking bonobo infants. For each infant that is trafficked, 2 adult bonobos are killed, said Ian Redmond to Mongabay, chairman of the Ape Alliance. Dr. Hart says that trafficking isn't very prevalent in Lomami, though killing for meat occurs, and its consumption is common, particularly for middle to upper class families. During a visit to Kindu, the governor of the Maniema province at the time mentioned that he would stop eating bonobos.
There's not much in our area. The main problem with bonobo killing in our area was for meat. And it was bonobo adults that they wanted. So we would find bonobo babies in villages where the mother was being, dried, roasted, as you would say, dried over fire and over smoke, and just behind the village, just behind the house. So it was considered a legitimate bushmeat. And in one of the first talk I gave in Kindu, the governor himself said, okay, well, I will be the first to say publicly, I will stop eating bushmeat. I'll stop eating bonobos. And he himself ate bonobo. You could buy a whole smoked bonobo for $60. And it was sort of, and it's also sold in very small pieces.
Dr. Hart says bonobos are typically trafficked via airplane, and Lomami is not easily accessible due to the lack of roads. However, she does mention some bonobo infants have been seen being moved from the buffer zone of the park to the southwest to the town of Loja, which does have an airport really 7 kilometers away.
Trying to move out baby bonobos is very difficult you have to do it either by airplane, really have to do it by airplane. And it's very difficult from Kindu and from, Opala. There's the roads. There really are no roads to use, and so I have been told that bonobos leave the southwest of the park. Bonobo babies have left the southwest of the park, so that would be coming from the buffer zone of the park, where there are quite a few bonobo, and move to Loja. We've been informed of that, and although bonobo killing has gone way down, it has not yet stopped.
If you listened to episode 1 of this podcast series, you'll recall how the DRC has opened up 27 blocks of land for oil and gas development. Currently, Lomami National Park does intersect with at least one of those blocks. While it's very possible that it could be developed, Dr. Hart is skeptical that it would, citing lack of infrastructure for it. She noted the difficulty she had in putting small airstrips in Lomami. She described it as almost impossible.
Well, there would take huge investment to take oil out of the Lomami. I'm not saying it won't happen. Like I said, the Lomami River itself couldn't carry much, can't take a large barge. So it wouldn't be easily possible at all. So I think that for Lomami National Park, it's probably not an immediate threat. I cannot speak for Salonga, and I cannot speak for other areas, but investment in Congo, this is, a blessing and a curse. Investment is not easy because the logistics are so difficult. And so much of the logistics has to be taken care of, and you have to pay so much all the way up the chain to put in any of these logistics. We know it just because we tried to put in very small airstrips in the Lomami National Park. It was almost impossible, and it hasn't happened yet. The administrative blockages and it's just heavy.
So you've heard no news of any plans to develop there?
Not in Lomami. Theoretically, they could, but exploiting underground gas or oil or in Virunga National Park is completely different than in the Lomami National Park. It's a short road to a border with Rwanda, and it's already a maintained road. So it's one of the first roads in Congo. So it's a completely different story than trying to exploit in Lomami, where there's not a single road that crosses the park. And the only north-south highway, if you would, is the Lomami River. And the Lomami River is not a commercial river.
As was discussed in the last episode, fortress conservation has a very complex, troubling, and often violent history in the Congo Basin. The idea of cordoning off local communities from land they relied upon in the name of conservation is what many protected areas have been based on. Some of that legacy carries over to this day. How to carry out conservation moving forward is a point of contention. Previous guests on this show argue there is no one specific model that can be applied across the board, and that community involvement should be a part of the conversation. Dr. Hart said to me, in the case of a national park, the buy-in and participation of local communities that live around the park and having them work for it is a critical factor.
The rules themselves are not enough. The guards themselves are not enough. What is important is to have the population around the park working for the park and considering the park a positive entity, something that they are proud of, something that protects their own way of living. And that is possible in a number of ways. The park itself was created, the park of the Lomami National Park. I'm not talking about Salonga. I'm not talking certainly about Kauzibiega. But the Lomami National Park was created very much with the help of local chiefs.
However, it should be noted that in the years leading up to the creation of Lomami National Park, a village known as Obegne used to reside inside the borders of what is now Lomami. When Mongabay reported on the story nearly 4 years ago, Dr. Hart said community members had already planned to leave the area, and their departure initially didn't have anything to do with the creation of the park. She says they were promised new homes from the German International Corporation for Cooperation and the World Bank, the latter of which, at the time of the reporting, Dr. Hart says, had done nothing. However, when Mongabay spoke with Maud Salber of the Rainforest Foundation UK, who surveyed 28 villages around Lomami, she told us that communities left Obegne in 2013 due to armed clashes, and some returned, but were forced out by the government in 2017. She says they didn't have a say in their relocation, and while there was an effort made to draw boundaries of the park to avoid villages, many communities still lost access to their customary lands. She said some communities complained of being harassed by authorities, and there was a documented case of sexual assault. Dr. Hart refuted some of this information, claiming that community members chose their own relocation site away from Obegne. She mentioned that residents in the new Obegne location had regular work from the park, and some were even rangers. She also told Mongabay that the human rights abuses were regrettable, and best practices are difficult to implement in remote areas with no police force or government presence.
And Lomami does not have minerals, which makes having a national park or any kind of a protected area much more difficult. If there's that kind of real value, monetary value within the park. But it does have animals, and bushmeat is a big business. But what many of these local chiefs at the sector level felt, and even at the groupement level felt, was that it was outside hunters that were coming in and taking the advantage. They were coming in, putting up many traps, coming in with guns, coming in night hunting, and taking out meat, and not leaving a benefit for the people, which is what often happens. This is, if you actually look at a village level, this advantage becomes mixed. You'll talk to some people who are very angry about it, and other people who are very, very pro, because the outside entities will often come and give a lot of ammunition, 0-0s to the local hunters, give them snare wire, etc., and then give them a portion of what they are able to catch. So that at the local villages, this is a very mixed reaction to the to the hunting ban. But at the groupement and the sector level, so out a little while, and the elder chiefs, there was a big push for a protection of some of the important uninhabited area.
Dr. Hart says it's important to make sure alternative income streams are available for local inhabitants around the park, and she claims they've been successful with this in Lomami, saying that many villages have requested more outposts as they are sources of income and jobs.
But a park is forever. So even if you have local people involved in the creation of the park, that doesn't mean that one generation later, 2 generations later, and with increasing population and with decreasing, without increasing livelihood options, you're going to continue to have support. So it's important at a very early stage to offer alternatives, to hire local people, to continue to work closely with the local people in a number of ways. And I would say that we have been quite successful around Lomami with this. Whether that will continue to be the case, there will be ups and downs, but there were a few incidents where, to tell you the truth, there are many more villages that want us to have patrol posts in them than we could ever do. There are now 10 patrol posts around the park. There are no patrol posts in the park. And any patrol post is a center that hires local people. It becomes a market. It buys rice, it buys fufu, buys dried fish. It becomes an important local market. And people are not only hired to work on the teams that go into the forest as porters and guides, but numbers of them have become guards themselves. So a fair number of the guards are from around the park. Unfortunately, the recruitment wasn't completely even, and there are areas where guards weren't taken from. So this kind of involvement with the local population, it has to be ongoing. A national park, if it's a fortress, it has to be a fortress because it's protected by local people.
When I asked Dr. Hart to clarify if there were ever any tensions that exist between local inhabitants and rangers, such as in the case where communities want to hunt, she says that only when boundaries are not made clear. She also claims representatives from many villages participated with park management to clarify those borders and reportedly found the effort effective.
The fact that people are hunting is not bad. It's only when they're hunting in the park that it is bad. And where we have had tensions have been places where people say, well, how do we know where the park border is? And so any place there's a natural border, it's clear. But where there is no natural border, it's not clear. And so that has been a problem. And it's a big affair putting in borders, marking borders. We had several groups come to us from the Mituku area and say, look, we don't have a clear idea of where this park begins. And so we had huge meetings, and many village, all the concerned villages sent representatives to the park border, and with GPS and various marking materials, we marked the border and we opened up the path. And so it'll have to be maintained, but that was very much appreciated. And so many people were involved. It was very positive.
Dr. Graham has worked in the Luo Scientific Reserve in the village of Wamba, which is notably a community-managed reserve. Though the presence of the research station has been here for many decades, the bonobo population has fluctuated. Dr. Graham says, in the long run, the presence of the research station and the community-managed model has been positive for the area.
Where I work in Wamba is called the Luo Scientific Reserve. And that's a model where people, so like communities who have always lived in this region, can continue to use the forest in the way that they always have, but it protects it against like mining and logging and agricultural companies from coming in and exploiting the area. And I think that's a really helpful model for conservation. And I think something that Terese Hart does really, really well, because communities are crucial for conservation. And if we're thinking about conserving species and ecosystems, like this includes like the people who live there and like their engagement with these ecosystems in the places that they live.
In a push to shift away from the fortress conservation approach, community-managed conservation is gaining a lot of attention as a way forward by many conservationists, including Dr. Hart. Where exactly the rubber meets the road on this, or how it's done, is harder to find a consensus on. Some conservationists argue that the only proven effective model for bonobo conservation is that of a national park or reserve, and that community concessions can lead to resource extraction and exploitation due to the struggles of securing financing for properly trained guards and the fact that resource extraction is often the only source of cash for communities that live in these areas. Recently, some attempts at providing communities with cash, such as CFCLs, through carbon credit schemes, have been described as scams by environmental and human rights advocacy groups. In 2022, Mongabay's John Cannon reported that some communities in the DRC signed contracts with a company called KMS, which reportedly would only give communities 10% of the share of the profits from these carbon schemes. Dr. Hart cautions that what works in one location may not necessarily work in another, and that the problems and challenges experienced in one park like Lomami are not the same as the ones experienced in others, and that approaches that include community-led conservation are going to need ongoing support specific to that area. She says these must include the input of a wide range of viewpoints, which may be from people who did not initially suggest the concession. She also stresses that giving rights back to a specific indigenous group can cause conflicts, as different groups can use or occupy the same piece of land over a period of time, leading to disagreement over who has a claim to the land.
There's many pushes to have non-park conservation. I'm not against it. We can only be for it. And that, you know, as much as people are sensibilized, you know, to the importance of animals and the importance of, and they want to protect their own lands, that's great. And there is this, these community concessions that, you know, are one of the big pushes in DR Congo. But unfortunately, these community concessions are almost always used for deforestation purposes. And the proceeds don't really go to they go to a few people. They don't go to the community generally. And so getting a CFCL and making the CFCL pertinent to conservation are two different areas, and it takes a long investment, as much as the investment as it does in a national park. You know, it takes a long investment. The one area that it you know, we think is quite positive, we had nothing to do with it, but it's the Nkuba CFCLs around Maiko. They have a long background, and I think it's Diane Fossey Gorilla Foundation that is now supporting them. And we actually sent people from our buffer zone to talk with the Nkuba leaders to sort of get a feel for what they were doing and you know, decide whether it was something that they would also like to do. And you know, I think that I think it's very positive, but to you know, to give land rights to local peoples, it can only be done in certain areas, because particularly in the forest, there's been so much movement of ethnic groups. You risk appearing to give ethnic rights to a group of people who are not the only people who say they have ethnic rights to that area. And that leads to violence, actually. So you have to be very careful in these CFCL operations. You have to include a lot more people than the people who are actually forming the CFCL to make sure it's not going to erupt in violence. But after you have the CFCL, there has to be a management plan and a management committee and a way for it to carry on, a way for them to control hunting, a way for them to, and you have to have something that will persist through generations, and that won't have the same likelihood of success in one area as it will in another area, and it won't have the same ease of formation in one area as another area. And there's a lot of immigration going on, and that complicates things. And so this thought that communities want to protect their own forest, that is positive, and should be encouraged, but how much they have the capacity to do so has to be looked at, and how much continuous input they need from the outside to be able to do it needs to be looked at.
Dr. Graham mentioned to me that there's evidence showing research sites protect the areas around them, and in her opinion, the way forward is to make sure these move into Congolese leadership.
So University of Kinshasa has a lot of very active primatologists and botanists, and like this sort of collaborative network within their biology department who do a lot of research and conservation work across the country. And I think particularly that like building those collaborative relationships and having research that is more led by like national and local researchers is a big part of that. There is really strong evidence that the presence of active research sites helps conservation in those areas. So really long-lasting research like Louis Cotal, like Lactumba, like Wamba, the presence of those sites sort of protects the areas around them, and being able to move those more into ownership by Congolese institutions, I think is the way forward.
One thing which we must mention is the importance of bonobos as an umbrella species for conservation, or species used for making conservation decisions, which thereby indirectly protect other species. Sally Coxe, co-founder and president of the Bonobo Conservation Initiative, spoke with me about her efforts in creating community-managed reserves. She sees the bonobo as a key umbrella species for conservation in the DRC.
Absolutely, I see them that way. And in our experience, they actually have proven to be already. Our organization, of course, is focused on bonobo conservation, and our guiding vision is one that we developed with the Congolese people that live in the habitat, and as well as other stakeholders, scientists, and government people, way back in 2001 for the Bonobo Peace Forest. And the idea there is to create a network or mosaic of community managed protected areas that are, driven by bonobo protection. And of course, a model in which sustainable development, supports the people at the same time. And our experience with that is in our work trying to protect the bonobos, we discovered bonobos in 12 important regions way back in the beginning when nobody really knew where they were. And we've gone on to create 2 nature reserves, community managed nature reserves at Kokolopuri and Sankuru. And just through our work in doing that, more communities have taken their own initiative to protect the bonobos in their areas and create their own community organizations and become part of the Bonobo Peace Forest. So the bonobo has been an amazingly strong flagship in our experience. For example, the Sankuru Nature Reserve, was both of these reserves were initiated by local people, local conservation efforts. And in the case of Sankuru, it was a local group that was focused on protecting the primates of Sankuru. We didn't even know at that time, back in the early 2000s, that bonobos existed that far south. So it was a big discovery that bonobo and okapi were found in this area. And even though the people of Sankuru didn't have taboos against hunting bonobos, which is the case at Kokolo-Puri. So it was a natural at Kokolo-Puri to do bonobo conservation because the local Mongandu people do protect them and have for generations. In Sankuru, the people realized it was more in their benefit to protect the bonobos than not to, and they learned. Many people didn't even know that bonobos were only found in the DRC. Many people didn't know it was against the law to hunt bonobos, and unfortunately, that's still the case in many areas. And they really are a charismatic species, and not only for conservation, but also for peace.
While bonobos are unique to the DRC, they are not the only great ape species in the country. I turned to Dr. Gladys Kalema-Zikusoka, a veterinarian and founder of the NGO Conservation Through Public Health, whose work in protecting mountain gorilla populations has been successful since she started work for the Ugandan Wildlife Service in 1996. In 2018, the population of mountain gorillas increased enough that their status on the IUCN Red List was downgraded from critically endangered to endangered. Mountain gorillas, unlike other great ape species, have seen their numbers increase over the past few decades. They also mostly live in protected areas. Their population stands around 1,000. But the success with this has come with the downside of a crowded and increasingly shrinking habitat, and the pressures on the land they rely on are only increasing. I wanted to get Dr. Gladys's insight into the lessons learned about mountain gorilla conservation and how these apply to other great ape species in the Congo Basin. Unlike bonobos, mountain gorillas live in Rwanda and Uganda in addition to the DRC. Here, Dr. Gladys explains what initially contributed to their population decline and their subsequent rebound, which she credits in part to the increase in tourism, the establishment of national parks, and income sources for local communities centered around gorilla conservation.
I would say that the mountain gorillas, having been discovered, I guess, in the 1900s, and then the Virunga population being studied very closely from the 60s, it was obvious that one of the biggest problems was habitat loss. They're in an area with a very high human population density, and people are always cultivating and taking more and more land. That was the original habitat of the mountain gorillas. So that was always the biggest threat. And poaching, where people were not necessarily poaching to eat the gorillas, at least in Rwanda and Uganda, when they were later discovered in Uganda in the late 80s. They were mainly poaching for duiker and bush pig and other animals they could eat, and gorillas accidentally get caught in snares or sometimes got speared if they confronted poachers. But there was also the illegal bushmeat trade, where some people wanted orphan gorillas, some people wanted the hands as ashtrays during the time when late Dr. Diane Fossey was studying the gorillas, the late 60s early, and the 70s. And so those were the main threats that were bringing the mountain gorilla numbers down. And habitat loss was really a big issue because the gorillas weren't bringing any benefits for the local community or the government, so there was really no need to keep that habitat going. And it was slowly being cut. But what has led to their rebound, I would say, is the fact that gorillas started to become beneficial to the government and to the local communities. And tourism has had a great role to play, because once gorilla tourism began, for example, I'll speak for the case of Uganda, the wind impenetrable forest was a forest reserve up to 1991. And up to that point, people could go in and cut trees sustainably. They could mine. They could use the forest how they wanted, and it was supposed to be sustainable, but it wasn't. Meanwhile, there's a high human population growth rate, and more of the forest habitat is being cut in an unsustainable manner. But the executive director of Uganda National Parks, Dr. Eric Edroma, realized that he led the effort that realized that if we don't turn it into a national park, the whole forest is going to disappear. And part of the reason why they got interested in turning it into a national park is that they found gorilla night nests, and when the fecal samples were examined, it was actually mountain gorillas, which is very exciting. And everyone thought, well, Rwanda's benefiting from mountain gorillas. Maybe we can in the near future. And that's exactly what happened. So one once tourism began and became a national park, people are no longer allowed in the forest unless they were going in for controlled activities such as tourism or, research. And this meant that immediately the habitat loss was reducing. Then they made sure that community members benefit from the gorillas through giving them jobs. A lot of poachers were hired as rangers, which really helped, rangers and trackers, because they know the forest really well, but they're earning more protecting the gorillas rather than killing the animals. And then they also made sure that some of the money from tourism goes to the local community. When I first went there as a vet student, there were only 2 habituated gorilla groups for tourism, and gorilla tourism had begun a year earlier. I went in 1994, and tourism began in 1993. So it was there's a big air of hope, because before tourism, the only form of employment was the tea factory, the nearby tea factory and outgrowers. So tourism created jobs, and at the same time, the veterinary care began. In Rwanda, it had been going for since the 80s, when the late Dr. Dan Fossey asked for mountain gorilla vets to start helping. In Uganda, I was the first vet hired to treat the mountain gorillas in 1996, and we were saving lives. More gorillas that would have died were surviving.
Today, however, mountain gorilla populations are heavily dependent on national parks in the Virunga Mountains in the DRC, Rwanda, and the Bwindi Impenetrable National Park in Uganda. The Sarambwe Reserve, which is on the very eastern edge of the DRC, adjacent to Bwindi, is also home to mountain gorillas. This entire area is part of what is known as the Albertine Rift, and it is the only place where mountain gorillas are known to exist. There has been great gains in their numbers, but the crowded environment, the violence, and the habitat loss continues to have an impact on them, particularly in the form of diseases.
Yeah, now that the numbers are increasing, the lack of habitat has now become a big issue. Habitat loss and disease are actually the biggest threats to the mountain gorillas because of tourism, tourists who can bring fatal flu like COVID, and gorillas going outside the park to eat people's banana plants and to forage in community land. Also because of lack of habitat. Where they used to go before is now taken up by people. Where they used to go before their forest was cut is taken up by people, and now they've lost their fear of people. They're going back to those places. So we're finding that in Bwindi area, close to half of the gorilla groups that are habituated for any purpose, mainly tourism, quite a number of them, maybe I'd say 30% of them, spend quite a lot of time outside the park, which isn't good because they can pick up diseases, there's injuries, people get hurt, gorillas get hurt, and so it's not good. So the biggest issue now, as the numbers are growing, which we're pleased about, is the lack of habitat.
So what can be done to expand their habitat? Dr. Gladys says in the short term, getting community members to sell their land to be a part of the protected area is needed.
I'd say that the mountain gorilla habitat is very specific and specialized. And yes, the habitat needs to expand because the numbers of gorillas are growing, but the space isn't growing, owing to successful conservation efforts. So there are many measures that need to be done. There's short-term measures and longer-term measures. But some of the short-term measures that really need to be done, of course, is, trying to convince community members to sell their land. In Virunga, it's been done. In Bwindi, there's an effort to get it done. The only issue in Bwindi is, our NGO is leading the effort, Conservation Through Public Health, is trying our best to talk to community members about selling their land. A lot of them are very willing to do so because there's a lot of conflict with wildlife. Wild animals come and destroy their crops and they can't really plant anything on their land. So there's a big effort. We're trying to fundraise for that. And we started off by doing a feasibility study funded by the Rainforest Trust. And we're looking to other donors, Rainforest Trust and other donors to support this. And this is a major issue because as the numbers are going up, the space isn't going up. So I think that's the short-term measure.
In the long term, Dr. Gladys says giving local communities access to family planning services and thereby allowing people to choose smaller families could help reduce habitat encroachment and human-wildlife conflict.
But other longer-term measures that are ongoing is promoting community-based family planning so people can have manageable families. So they have fewer children who need less land. There's a lot of land wrangles when someone has 10 children, they each want a piece of land. They can end up encroaching on the habitat of the forest habitat of the mountain gorillas and other wildlife. So there's different measures that are going on to try and reduce this pressure on the gorillas, on the habitat of the gorillas.
This raised the question again, which I had in regards to the fortress conservation model discussed in the last episode. How are local populations consulted and included in these discussions? Similar to what Dr. Hart discussed, where there was a buffer zone in Lomami for local communities to use, Dr. Gladys says, at least in Bwindi, a buffer was created for tea cultivation. A similar approach, she suggests, should be used in future park expansions and ensuring income streams are available via tourism and other sources.
Once the local communities sell their land, it's not as simple as just selling their land. They still have to continue to be engaged in conservation. They still need to be better off than when they were before. And the best way is to keep engaging them in conservation. I mean, one thing that was done in the southern sector of Bwindi was to put up a buffer zone for tea. This was led by International Gorilla Conservation Program, working closely with Uganda Wildlife Authority. And it was done in around, I would say, late 90s, early 2000. And this buffer zone for tea means that community members can still cultivate tea and have an income, but the habitat of the gorillas is expanded. And so even as we're looking into trying to expand it, like we have a narrow neck at Bwindi, which is almost cutting off the northern and the southern sector of Bwindi. At that narrow neck, we need to expand that part. But even if we do, as we do, once we're successful, we still need to make sure that community members benefit from it. They're still part of the tourism industry, they're still part of conservation efforts in whatever way. And so that's always the best way to do it. Yes, we buy land from them, but we still engage them in conservation and make sure that they're benefiting and they're still part of the conservation story. And that's the only way that you can ensure that that the mountain gorillas and other species will be safe.
But what about community-led conservation? Dr. Gladys, who attended the Africa Protected Areas Congress in 2022, echoed sentiments that were spoken there, saying that community-led, not just community-based conservation, is really important, regardless of outside funding or outside support.
There was this whole thing of we have to engage. It's all about community-led as opposed to community-based conservation. There was a huge emphasis on that in the APAC resolutions. And I feel that is really important because the communities need to have ownership and need to feel that they can continue doing it, whether with or without donor funding, with or without government support. So it's really, really important to get communities to be the leaders in conservation in their area. And there's a big drive towards that. So I know there was a lot of discussion about conservancies. We've just started the conservancy movement in Uganda. And conservancies is really, a lot of wildlife is found outside protected areas. And landowners would convert that land to plant sugarcane or something that's not compatible with conservation. And then that wildlife disappears forever. But we're trying to convince landowners that you can actually benefit by having wildlife on your land in various ways. One of them is tourism. It's been proven to work in Namibia, Kenya, South Africa. Other ways is, there are other ways of using that land. Others talk about sport hunting. And so I'm an advisory board member of UMOJA, which is a conservancy association, a bottom-up conservancy association that began 2 years ago to try and get all the landowners in Uganda who have wildlife to start developing conservancies and to work together to do this. And so there was a big move about that, and there were lots of people sharing lessons from setting up conservancies. It's normally a public-private partnership between the community, the lodges, the tour operators who can bring about very nice lodges, and it's all a public-private partnership.
Conservation Through Public Health, the NGO that Dr. Gladys founded, trains community health workers to do conservation work, which helps spread awareness of how locals can access tourism revenue and other streams of income, and help discourage the bushmeat trade, which is a major driver of great ape deaths.
So it's something that I believe is really, really important. In the case of our organization, Conservation Through Public Health, we work with community health workers and train them to do conservation work. And they're the ones who go out and do this work. They do it as volunteers. They're not paid a salary. So that even in between donor funding, they've been doing this. And they talk to people about good health and hygiene, how to be healthy and hygienic so gorillas don't get sick. They also talk about the dangers of bushmeat hunting because they can get zoonotic diseases, the importance of protecting the forest. And they also talk to community members how they can access tourism revenue, how they can actually access revenue sharing money. And all of this helps the coexistence between the people and the gorillas and other wildlife. And they're the ones, we empower them to do this themselves, and it's working really well. And they're reaching over 7,000 households and 40,000 people in 7,000 households. But that's another example of community-led conservation.
Taking a step back to talk about the threat of 27 blocks of land on auction in the DRC for oil development, I wanted to ask Dr. Gladys about this. A very large portion of Virunga National Park is on the land being auctioned. So I asked her what she thinks of this and how it could affect great ape conservation.
I would say that that decision to open up land for oil development is going to be detrimental for the mountain gorillas and other wildlife in the Virunga area, the Virunga Massif, and the whole Virunga National Park. I know it's a very big national park. It doesn't only have mountain gorillas, but I don't think it's going to be good in the long run.
Dr. Gladys points out, in the presence of violence, which occurs frequently in the Albertine Rift, tourism is simply a difficult prospect for conservation, making oil and gas a more attractive source of economic development. She says that this kind of development isn't a threat in Uganda because of the strong tourism sector, which relies on the presence of gorillas and contributes a massive amount of money to the local economy. The same cannot be said of the DRC.
But I mean, part of the reason the government is doing this is there isn't any other economic, activity going on. Tourism is barely picking up because of conflict in the area. So that kind of a thing is unlikely to ever happen in Uganda and Rwanda because mountain gorilla tourism is contributing 60% of the revenue in Uganda for all the national parks. And in Rwanda, it's even higher. I think it's as high as 80%. And the government is like, we can't do anything to harm our gorillas. And until DRC gets to that level, unfortunately, it's going to be oil. Another time, it's going to be something else. So at the end of the day, it's one of the poorest countries in the world. They need to feed their people. So I'm just looking at it from both sides of the argument. It's very, very sad, but there has to be something. There has to be an economic activity that lifts them out of poverty that's compatible with conservation. It could be carbon finance, it could be whatever it is. But if the people who have oil, the oil companies are paying more, unfortunately, this is what happens. I see potential for tourism to take place in the DRC as long as there is no conflict or the conflict is controlled. As long as there's conflict, it's going to be very, very, very difficult. Very difficult. I know people who have been killed, staff members, we've heard of tourists who have been abducted. One of our staff almost got abducted. I mean, it really limits what you can do there. I've heard of lodge owners saying, they work in Rwanda and DRC in Uganda, and they're like saying, we'd love to work in DRC, but our business is going to collapse. We're going to it's not sustainable. Imagine a tourist gets abducted, all of that stuff that goes with it, ransom and all that. It's just not worth it. So the security in the area has to first be managed before you can have tourism. I believe Dr. Emmanuel Domerod and his team are trying to do agriculture, because with agriculture, it can still continue with conflict. As long as the community members there are benefiting from it, they're less likely to enter the park to poach, collect firewood, and destroy the habitat. We have to find other ways of keeping things going in spite of conflict. But for tourism, there has to be no conflict. It's very difficult for anyone to go there if you know that you may not come out alive.
The question on what is the best way to provide economic development, protect biodiversity, while addressing the injustices of fortress conservation is an open one and incredibly difficult to answer, particularly in the face of ongoing violence. In February of 2021, the Italian ambassador to the DRC, Luca Attanasio, was murdered in a convoy in Virunga National Park along with his bodyguard and a United Nations driver. Violent attacks like this, while tragic in and of themselves, make conservation projects all the more difficult to implement. And some conservationists have argued that militarized conservation units aid in securing vulnerable areas where state-level security isn't up to the task. It's not an easy situation to sort out or make progress on. But in addition to security, Dr. Gladys says national leadership needs more representation from Africans from critical habitats like Virunga.
But one thing that we're doing is building African leadership in conservation. I'm the vice president of the African Primate Society, because once you have African leaders people who are leaders in primate research and conservation, and they become members of parliament, and they become presidents of these countries, such decisions are unlikely to be made. And that's one thing that people have to really understand. It's very, very important that the people from the countries where the wildlife is from become leaders in the conservation field. Because once they get up there and they make those big decisions, you will see that they won't allow oil companies to come and drill in such a critical habitat like the Virunga.
Dr. Gladys also says a lot more funding on an international scale would be needed to go into the DRC, surpassing what oil companies could offer, to both protect biodiversity and increase security. One bid for the land in Virunga that intersects with the proposed oil concessions includes that of a U.S. fintech company that wants to sell biodiversity and carbon credits from the land. The company, EQX Biome, argues it would generate more revenue than oil and gas could provide. Though, notably, in May of this year, it was announced that the CEO of Verra, the world's foremost carbon credit standard organization, would be stepping down amid what has been increased scrutiny on the lack of effectiveness of carbon credits as a means to reduce carbon in the atmosphere, Mongabay's John Cannon reported. So placing hopes on carbon credits as an economic model for conservation is on shaky ground, to say the least. As of yet, there doesn't seem to be any apparent economic replacement for oil and gas development, though many nations and conservation experts alike recognize that one is sorely needed.
DRC is a country that has so much potential. It still has so much potential, but it has so many interests. The forest is a climate modulator, and everybody benefits from it. But also it's a heart. And if those forests disappear, the whole world is going to suffer. And I really feel that there needs to be a lot more funding going in there. More funding than what the oil companies can give, or other unsustainable activities that destroy this critical, very large rainforest. And there has to be a global effort to fund this and fund activities and reduce insecurity in the area. It just has to be a global effort.
I'd like to thank Dr. Hart, Dr. Gladys, Sally, and Dr. Graham for speaking with me on this episode of Mongabay Explores. This was episode 3. I'm your host, Mike DiGirolamo. Editorial support for this episode was provided by Isabel Esterman, Tana Giuse, and Eric Hoffner. The script was written by myself. The soundscape heard in the intro and outro was recorded in Invindo National Park by Zuzana Buravalova, Walter Mbami, Tatiana Sachivi, and Serge Ekazama. They would like to acknowledge Masaha and Invindo National Park. If you enjoyed this episode of Mongabay Explores and you want to support us, please tell a friend about this podcast series. Word of mouth is the best way to help expand our reach, and you can also support us by heading to patreon.com at patreon.com/Mongabay, and you can donate to help us cover production costs and hosting fees for all of our podcast content. Don't forget to leave a review of this show on the platform you're tuning in on today, as that also helps our visibility. Keep up with Mongabay on all of our social media platforms, from Facebook, Mastodon, LinkedIn, to Instagram, where our handle is @Mongabay, or on Twitter @MongabayOrg. We'll be back soon with another episode in this Congo Basin series of Mongabay Explores.